Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic, as you can see, is the rise of labor. Now, before we begin, as always, take a quick moment, jot down that lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms on the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them together as well as to their larger historical significance. Now, with that, let's begin. Now, we left off, we were talking about the rise of big business. With the ever-increasing profits of corporations and trusts in the late 19th century, known as industrialization. But that is not what this time period is called. This time period is known as the Gilded Age. Why? Because in 1873, Mark Twain wrote an essay, a satirical piece known as The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. Now, before we go on what he wrote, does anyone know what gilded actually means? And I always find usually in the classroom, one or two students tend to know this. But what it actually is, you take something of little value and you put a shiny veneer or plate of precious metal. So you take something that's unvaluable, like lead, and you cover it with something like a thin layer of gold or silver. And it comes gold plated or silver plated, right? That's gilded. That's what it means. And so on the outside, it's a shiny veneer of glory. It looks wonderful. It's shiny. It's cute. It's pretty. But underneath, it's a mess or it's unvaluable. Again, you should never want to buy your significant other, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, something that is gold-plated or gilded. You buy them the real thing, especially when you propose. So Mark Twain, back to him. Now, he penned this piece known as The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, in which he portrayed the United States as a society as thinly gilded in gold. What does he mean by this? He says the industrial era from 1870s through about 1900, this period is known as the Gilded Age. So from about 1865 post-Civil War all the way to 1900, we have this era known as the Gilded Age. So if the shiny veneer is the gold beautifulness of industrialization, corporations, people getting rich, what's underneath it? What's under that shiny veneer? Well, in short, societal problems. To give you a visual of this, hear me out. Right, it's gold-plated, right? That's what we kind of term what gilded means. Put in Dr. Olmsted's terminology, the Gilded Age is gold-plated crap. Yeah, you heard it. The Gilded Age is gold-plated crap. Now, to be fair, many people, and most people even, were better off during this period than they were prior to the Civil War. Standard of living for everyone had risen. But it does not change the fact there were some deep societal problems. And I got news for you. The gold was pretty. Skyscrapers, corporations, oil, black gold, right? But underneath it all, under that shiny veneer, was a whole lot of crap. So how much did life suck in the Gilded Age? Oh, let me count the ways. Wealth inequality, low wages, long hours, poor working conditions, no laws that protect the workers themselves, high workplace injuries and fatalities, and of course, the ever ubiquitous child labor. So how much does life suck in the Gilded Age? Oh, let us count the ways. There's a whole lot of crap that we need to walk through and push through here. Let's start with number one, there, wealth inequality. How much does life suck in the Gilded Age? Let me count the ways. Wealth inequality. During the Gilded Age, the richest 2% of American families owned more than a third of the nation's wealth. Moreover, the top 10% owned 3/4 of all the wealth. Now, anyone who took History 1301, U.S. history up to 1877, may remember that I usually show a triangle pyramid chart when discussing Elizabethan England. That's all well and good. Remember at the top there's the richest 1%. Then you have that middle class. Then you have those underlings. 50% of the population own nothing. Well, in this case, 90% of our population controls 25% of the wealth. Put it a different way, a little visual for you. All of the nation's tangible physical assets are in the hands of fewer than half of its families. Am I starting to sound like Bernie Sanders here? The richest 2% control more than a third of all the wealth. All of America's assets are in the hands of a few families. This is just the start. The stats are even more depressing when we get to the actual workforce during the Gilded Age. Remember who makes up our workforce, right? Immigrants. Unskilled, semi-skilled whites. African Americans, some Mexican, women and children. Pay was crappy. You want to complain about your wages right now in your little job you work? Oh, no. Wages were crappy. 21.5 cents per hour. Your average annual earnings were less than $500. And your average work week was 59 hours a week. Remember, there's no minimum wage here. There's no maximum. There's no overtime. No. The average work week is 59 hours, which means you're working at least 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. And remember, this is average. Many factory workers put in regularly 12-hour shifts per day. Some in steel mills work 84 hours a week, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. There's no such thing as overtime pay. There's no laws that protect these workers. Working conditions were hazardous and horrendous. Just give me an example, railroads. Between 1890 and 1917, right? So between 1890 and 1970, less than 30 years, there were 72,000 worker deaths. 72,000 worker deaths in 27 years. Coal mines, you're in the constant threat of cave-ins, explosions, underground toxic gases. Iron and steel mills, remember those hot tamales from making steel using the Bessemer process? Yeah, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. You were constantly on the edge of falling into those vats of hot molten steel. There's no rails, there's no safety features to protect the workers. Textile mills, they require a quick work pace. They speed it up constantly using large machines, threatening mutilation and dismemberment. So you might not die, but the odds are you will lose a few fingers or hands as they get stuck in the thing. You ever seen the movie Wanted? It's an interesting movie, but if you remember, Wesley has to put his hand in and try to grab the shuttle as it flies by, the flying shuttle of a weaving loom. He has to stick it in and pull it out before it hits his hand and cuts him. Now imagine doing that without supposedly superhuman reflexes as the movie depicted. You try to reach your hand into a moving shuttle as it's moving, it'll cut your hand or finger off. America's growth with industrialization. Despite us becoming the leader in the world in industrialization, we became the only industrial nation in the world not to have workmen's compensation to help those injured on the job. Nowadays, with some exceptions, for example, right now, coronavirus, workers may not get workmen's compensation because you can't guarantee where they contracted the virus. But back then, there was no such thing as workmen's compensation. Oh, there were in other countries, but not in the United States. You see the stat on your screen. You see 1913 alone, 25,000 factory fatalities, 700,000 injuries. Guys, I want you to know, we did not have workmen's compensation. We had no standards of safety for our businesses. But the United States led the world in workplace factory accidents. So USA number one. Because there was no regulation. This was unfettered, unregulated capitalism. during the Gilded Age. There was no protection, no compensation, nothing for workers to do. And the fact is, what choice do they have? They're going to quit, right? And do what? And quite honestly, the way it usually works, if you want to complain while you're at the job, what would happen is say, hey, come here. Hey, foreman, we just get like a bathroom break here every now and then? Or maybe a rail here to protect you from falling overboard after a 12-hour day working the hot heat of the steel mills? And the foreman says, hey, come here. That's not a bad idea, but let me show you this first. You see over there? Yeah, you see that window right there? Let's go look at that window. Come with me. You see those 100 people standing outside the gate of our factory? Any one of them would love to have your job. So shut up and get back to work. And that was the nice way a foreman would handle you if you complain about your job. The other way would be to, well, just fire you on the spot and hire someone else who's willing to take your job, maybe even working for less money. This is a little bit out of the time frame. I'll probably read the story later on again. There was a story I read in an interview when I was doing research for my dissertation where a worker complained that he was so sick that he's going to pass out. And the foreman responded to him saying, well, die and prove it. And sure enough, the man passed out and they literally had to carry him out of the building. There's no law against this. This is what's called unfettered, unregulated capitalism. Oh, and guys, it gets worse. Child labor is rampant. One of the more grotesque features of the Gilded Age was the prominent use of child labor. Now, of course, child labor is not new. But when America was largely agricultural, it made sense. You had children, they worked the farm. No one had a real big issue with this. They pitched in and helped on the farm. But after the Civil War, child labor becomes much more pronounced as part of factory labor. They perform a number of tasks that were usually you would think would be reserved for adults. They operated machines. They dug out coal. So they would be mining for coal. They would stitch clothing. They would shuck oysters. Now, anybody ever been in New Orleans and seen oysters being shucked? It's dangerous with a big knife. They canned food. They blowed glass. Like glass blowing. Like hot heat fire. Yeah, that. They would tend the looms in the textile mills. And the thing is, they were so nice. Child labor was so wonderful for owners for a few reasons. Number one is, hey, you pay them less because, they're children. Well, how are they going to complain? Second of all, their little hands were perfect sizes for reaching in to the machinery to unjam the machinery or to unstick the switch. And of course, if the machine kicked back on with their hands in there, they lose a finger or a hand and they can no longer work. The thing is, parents were so desperate for money, not because they're greedy, but to survive. They can't make ends meet. So they often felt they had no choice but to send their children to work. You see the stats on your screen, right? In 1870, we have 750,000 children working between ages 10 to 15 years old, full-time working. By 1880, we're up to 1.1 million, and by 1900, 2 million. In the cotton mills, a quarter of all the employees were under the age of 15. Half of those are under the age of 12. These are children, all younger than you who are in this class. And yet you were trying to work, and balance your job down at the Pizza Hut with, school. There's no school for these kids. There's no hope for a better future to become Andrew Carnegie and improve your lot in life because you're stuck working 12 hours a day, 84 hours a week as a 12-year-old. But don't worry, though. There's some good news here. The foreman took extra pity on children. So, for instance, children, like many of you who are probably watching this video or sat in one of my classes, many of you may be nodding off occasionally. But the foreman at your factory will treat you very well if you do, because you are a child and maybe you're exhausted after this is your sixth straight day of 12-hour days. And so they would often take a bucket of cold water and dump it on your head. Something I really wish we could do in public schools. And that's if you're lucky, by the way, as a child in the Gilded Age, because if you're lucky, it's a bucket of water. It could just as easily be a bucket of spit or of someone who's been using chewing tobacco, the spittoon. It could also be, of course, urine from the bucket in the corner. So if you're lucky, it's a clean, cold water. More than likely, though, it's probably not. And it'll wake you up, of course. And of course, children are 3 times more likely to die or be injured on the job. They'll be more plagued with respiratory diseases because of unventilated buildings or unventilated spaces in the mines. In other words, man, woman, or child, humans are commodities during the Gilded Age. They are nothing more than a piece of machinery, a resource to be used and exploited by the business owners. There are no laws, no regulations, and so businesses can impose whatever wages and working conditions they want to maximize their profits. And the good machines made producing goods easier. They made life easier, right? They also reduced the need for skilled laborers, meaning unskilled laborers are infinitely replaceable. They are completely expendable because you can always get someone new to turn a knob, fill the machine, or reach their hand inside. And again, what choice did workers have? Now, big surprise, as you can imagine, I'm sure this comes as a big shock to you, workers became pretty resentful of big business owners. They saw the low wages, the poor working and living conditions, the child labor. But then they saw the juxtaposition was that profits were rising. Businesses were expanding rapidly. And workers began to fight back. This becomes the birth of the American labor movement. Remember, you can only push a worker so far. It doesn't matter what job it is. It doesn't matter if they're the $1 million athlete. It doesn't matter if they're the teacher who's trying to teach you a class. It doesn't matter if they're the grocery store clerk. It doesn't matter if they're working at the factory. Everyone has their breaking point. And when you ask too much of them, too much of workers as a whole, there's one thing to always keep in mind. Workers are more numerous. And if enough of them organize together, owners really can't stop them. States can't stop them. Oh, they'll try. We've seen it in our country with protests in 2020. When people begin to rise up and protest, there will be resistance to it. But there are more people who are fed up than those who are in leadership. And as you can imagine, in the Gilded Age, workers had had enough. And this became the birth of the American labor movement. Now, I'm not saying this was easy. This is not necessarily a good, feel-good story. This is difficult, and people are going to die as a result. Because do you think that those conditions we just talked about were right for organization? Well, yes, definitely. They want to, but the conditions they're in are not conducive to organization. You're working 84 hours a week, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's simply not the time to even think about organizing. This is by design by the owners. And besides, this was their livelihood. There are no laws protecting labor organizations. So this is very risky stuff because even if you mention the word union, you could be fired for it. And hey, for instance, here in Texas right now, teachers, for example, because I am a teacher, right? Teachers can't call their unions actual unions. They must call them professional organizations because the state of Texas has banned unions. and barred the right to strike. By the way, for teachers, fun fact, the risk of striking is loss of your teaching license and potential loss of your retirement, your pension. Again, big deterrent to teachers trying to rise up and strike. But besides the time issue, there are other obstacles too. Think about the workforce here in the Gilded Age. It's diverse, right? We had immigrants who speak many different languages. They harbored animosity toward other ethnicities and racial groups. There are African Americans and Mexicans, there's whites. Do you think they all could get along? Should they? Well, of course they should. But owners did everything they can to prevent their unification. Again, hiring new immigrants from foreign countries who didn't speak the language, that's a detriment to organization. Using racial division between white workers and African American workers to prevent them from organizing based on a common shared oppression, which they should do, they instead play the race card to create division and say, well, at least we're not black for the white workers. They played it in such a way that even these immigrants who were seen as foreigners, they slowly became white in the factories just because they weren't black. Now, nonetheless, there were some strikes that would happen occasionally, and usually in a direct response to wage cuts or other major grievances. Now, most often these strikes early on were very disorganized. And so we think of this period, early period, as being disorganized labor. Remember, there's no legal protection for these workers. And in fact, big business will often court the federal government to step in and help them. Now remember, theoretically, they believe what's called laissez-faire economics, right? The federal government, our country, capitalism, was the idea, I'm sure this term you guys all know, was laissez-faire, hands-off economics, right? And so the government should be hands-off, let the market correct itself, let business take care of itself. That's what it's supposed to be. But as we're going to see, the government was anything but hands-off. They just chose to put their hands on the side of the business owners. And what we're going to see is most often these strikes in labor activity end in violence. Now, one of the first major, huge strikes in our country, again, it's not the only one, this is a major one, happened in July of 1877. This is as a direct result of the Panic of 1873. So let's go back in time for a minute. You remember in our Reconstruction lecture, we talked about the Compromise of 1877, right? This was the election with Rutherford B. Hayes, lost to Samuel Tilden, but in a corrupt bargain decided to, hey, we'll give you the presidency, Rutherford B. Hayes, if you pull the troops out of the South, which they did. And I talked about that lecture, how in 1873 there was a panic, an economic downturn, a depression. And that depression had lasted for 4 years into the election of 1876, which is one of the reasons why Tilden was actually beating Hayes. Well, let's go back to that event now. There's an economic downturn in 1873, depression for almost 4 years here. By the time 1877 comes around, we're in the 4th year of this major recession, depression. And during this time, railroads, in this case the Baltimore and the B&O Railroad, again, the Monopoly Board, B&O Railroad, they had cut their wages by 10% in 1877. Well, 10%, okay, it's a 4-year. No. This is the 3rd time in 5 years they've cut your wages. Now, all the while, though, please make note, all the while they cut your wages and cite the recession, the trusts that hold them are making record profits. But because they have the plethora of cheap labor coming in, it's easy to keep prices down and even roll back wages. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this, how much workers actually lost in real dollars. In 1873, a brakeman on the train would earn $70 a month. Not bad. 4 years later, in 1877, that same brakeman who was making $70 a month is now making $30 a month. His wages have been cut by more than half. Likewise, a conductor. This is a pretty good position, right? This is someone who has some skill to conduct the trains. In 1873, they were making $90 a month. Just 4 years later, in July of 1877, they are now making $50 a month. As a result of this third pay cut in 5 years, this 10% pay cut, workers walked off their jobs all around the eastern part of the country, starting with the B&O Railroad in Martinsville, Virginia. And strikers began up through Pennsylvania, began to walk off the job in protest. They began to strike, withhold their labor in protest for a restoration of their wages that had been cut so drastically. The strike is going to paralyze industry in our country. Because remember, the railroads are the primary form of transportation in 1877. They do transportation, communication, and of course, ship all your industrial supplies across the country. So what are your options now? Well, call in military. In this case, it's the state militias. And so in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania agrees with the business owners, the owners of the railroad, that they will send in the militia and try to force the workers to return back to work by using a show of force and violence. Now, I'm sure from watching the news in 2020, you've seen that when authorities enter with violence, it tends to beget more violence. In this case, the militia opened fire on the strikers, killing 20 workers. Now, in response to this, workers were fed up. You just killed 20 innocent people who were protesting, which, by the way, is a constitutional right. Now, not the right to purchase an individual company, but to protest. In response, the workers began to burn the rail yard, destroying millions of dollars of property. And this is where there becomes a big problem. Because the militia came in, instigated violence, killed 20 people, which precipitated the workers to retaliate by burning the rail yard. Millions of dollars of property damage done. Well, the strike will last 45 days total. Finally, it ends when President Rutherford B. Hayes, remember the Congress of 1877, sent in the U.S. military from city to city, putting the strike down by force. 26 more workers will be killed. One reporter who was reporting on the incident called it, quote, the most horrible event ever witnessed, except in the carnage of war, unquote. Eventually, even public sympathy evaporated. So don't tell me the military will never be used against its own citizens. Of course, if you go back to the first half of U.S. history, talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. 10,000 soldiers sent out to go collect taxes. Here, workers are striking to survive. Their wages have been cut drastically despite record profits by the company. And they send in the U.S. military to put it down by force. And of course, in this case, the strikers have no bargaining power under the law and eventually have to back off. And the Great Railroad Strike is a great epic failure for workers. However, there are some legacies here. 3 important legacies of the Great Railroad Strike. Number 1, it sets the tone for how or what the reaction will be. That workers will fight for wages, better hours, etc., but will be defeated most often by military force. Number 1. Number 2, it will actually lead to the building of armories in major U.S. cities. Yeah, you heard that right. We didn't build armories in major U.S. cities to protect in the den of war. We built armories in major U.S. cities to prevent labor from protesting for better work conditions, higher wages, etc. And number 3, it will lead to the influx of organized labor unionization. And that's a topic we'll discuss in our second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and Bye-bye.